Hey, what is up guys, Murgerman4 here, and today I'll be continuing my look back at the modern series of Doctor Who with Series 3. By this point, David Tennant has fully settled into the role of the Doctor, and it's great to see him form a dynamic with a new companion, as well as re-encountering old foes as the last of the Time Lords arc comes to a head. The scope of stories the show can tell continues to be broadened, and we're introduced to arguably the greatest creation since the show came back in The Weeping Angels. So, let's dive in to Series 3. I have a lot of nostalgia for this season. It holds some of my earliest memories of the show. I distinctly remember catching glimpses of David Tennant jumping between hovercars and Gridlock and the big CGI monster from the Lazarus Experiment. And the trilogy that makes up the finale were the very first episodes I ever saw in full. So I'm very much looking forward to revisiting it, starting with the Runaway Bride. RTD's second Christmas special is nothing groundbreaking. In fact, outside of being our introduction to Donna, I'd say it's pretty forgettable all around. It doesn't play into the Christmas aspect as much as the Christmas invasion, which I honestly think is to its benefit, but what Christmassy stuff it does have basically retreads the exact same ground, with the robot Santas and killer Christmas trees, which kind of gives the impression that RTD has already run out of ideas for what to do with the holiday. I'm also not enthralled with the villain. I mean, the Rachnos is a great design, but the characterization is pretty generic, and while I wouldn't say Sarah Parrish gives a bad performance, it is kind of hard to engage with. Similarly, we have the twist villain of Lance, Donna's husband-to-be, but he feels much more like a plot device than a character. Thankfully, we also have Donna, who is well characterized, brilliantly performed, and hugely memorable. I don't know if this is because of the benefit of hindsight, but it's kind of crazy to me that this was originally intended to be a one-off appearance, because it feels so much like a proper companion introduction, and her chemistry with David Tennant is superb. I really like how abrasive she is, willing to push back against the Doctor, and I'm glad we got to see their relationship expanded upon later. But yeah, Donna really is the saving grace of this episode for me, alongside one or two interesting set pieces like the chase on the highway. Even with those aspects, though, I won't be giving The Runaway Bride anything higher than a 7 out of 10. If there's one word that comes to mind when I think of Smith & Jones, it's fun. In typical RTD fashion, it's fairly light, but there's lots of great, memorable ideas that carry its simplicity a long way. And the humor is much more assured and genuinely funny than something like New Earth or Space Babies. So, what are these memorable ideas? The image of the hospital on the moon is great. You don't have to have that, but it adds a little bit of spectacle and does its job to increase the stakes. The Plasmavore is a lot of fun too. I really like the idea of a biological shape changer rather than a physical one, with the bendy straw adding just the right amount of silly to a fairly gruesome form of murder, and perfectly setting up the Doctor's resolution of tricking the Plasmavore into drinking his blood, believing him to be human. And the Judoon are, of course, iconic. Police for hire who only care about justice as far as the rulebook goes. You can't really reason with them, you just have to outwit their hard-headedness, which makes for a unique challenge. And of course, this story introduces us to Martha Jones, who is superb right from the start. I love the opening sequence where we see her dealing with all her family members. Simple, but tells us so much about her strength of character and level-headedness. She's a very easy character to love, and this episode perfectly leaves you wanting to see more of her. So yeah, this isn't an exceptional story, but it's a very solid one, told well, and certainly one of RTD's best openers. Smith & Jones will be getting a high-end 7.5 from me. This episode seems to get a lot of flack, but I've always found the Shakespeare Code to be pretty entertaining. It's a fun setting, with Shakespeare making for a great guest star. I love the approach of him just being an admittedly very talented, regular guy who feels very down to earth in spite of the pedestal the Doctor puts him on. And the running gag of Shakespeare nicking his own quotes from the Doctor's usage of them is great. I also find the Carrionites to be an effective threat. I do enjoy when Doctor Who draws from more traditional monsters, and witches in Shakespeare is obviously a perfect fit. And Martha continues to charm. I only wish the Doctor had accepted her as a full-time companion from the start. I know he's still getting over Rose, but the resistance feels out of character to me. I will say, though, I wish the danger of racism with time travel hadn't been brushed off so quickly. I don't think the whole episode should have been about it, but seeing as Martha is the first full-time companion of color, it really should have been given more significance than this. However, that's a relatively minor complaint. On the whole, the Shakespeare Code doesn't do anything extraordinary, but it does the job. 7 out of 10. I don't really know what to make of Gridlock. I really love the central idea of it, a sci-fi traffic jam that has lasted literal decades, and it's got a lot of heart with some strong character work. And yet, for some reason that I can't quite pinpoint, I just don't like it as much as I feel I ought to. I think it might come down to the guest cast, who, outside of Brannigan, do absolutely nothing for me. There's also the Macra, who are treated as incredibly generic monsters, as for whatever reason, RTD decided to remove their intelligence, which was the whole thing that made them interesting in their original appearance. I mean, they're not an iconic enough monster to care that much about the downgrade. I just don't think it adds anything. On the other hand, there are some brilliant scenes. Despite his limited screen time, the face of Beau's death is genuinely moving, and the bit where Martha confronts the Doctor about lying about his people, and he sits down to tell her the truth, is phenomenal. So, yeah, I guess I just kind of find it hard to reconcile these aspects. So as a result, I want to give it a higher score, but if I'm being honest with how I feel, I can't really give it any more than a 7 out of 10. It's rare for a story to actually do something different with the Daleks. And while Daleks in Manhattan and Evolution of the Daleks may retread some of the ground from the Second Doctor story, The Evil of the Daleks, it does it in a way that still feels fresh and exciting. Certainly, the Dalek material is the most exciting thing the story has to offer. The Cult of Skaro is a brilliant idea which there wasn't time to explore properly in last season's finale, and here they have the limelight, experimenting and imagining beyond the normal Dalek remit to find new ways of survival. The resulting human-Dalek hybrid embodied by Dalek Sec is fantastic. I love the way he gradually begins to feel more and more human emotions, growing to despise the Daleks' lust for death and seeking the Doctor's assistance. Likewise, I love how resistant the other Daleks are to this, ultimately imprisoning and exterminating their former leader. I'm always a fan of some Dalek infighting. Elsewhere, the setting of 1930s Manhattan works reasonably well, and while I kinda wish the pig slaves had been Robomen instead, they do the job. There's also some nice guest characters. Solomon in particular is a highlight, and his extermination after offering the hand of friendship to the Daleks is a prime example of their brutality. I think the story does feel a tad too long, but in spite of its reputation, I also think there's a lot to like here. A very solid 7.5 out of 10. Yet another story that I seem to appreciate more than most. I mean, I don't really have that much to say about it, but it's fun to see the new series tackling the mad scientist trope, with Richard Lazarus' attempt to rewrite human DNA, unwittingly turning him into a monster. Hardly unique, but I think it's pretty solid, and I can't say the wonky CGI bothers me at all. There's also some interesting, if rather undeveloped, commentary on humanity's relationship with death, and how what a person does in their lifetime is more important than how long they live. I like that we get to see a bit more of Martha's family too. Tish is great, and Francine's pretty solid too, although I do think the Mr. Saxon arc is laid on a bit too thick. I tend to prefer when Doctor Who's arcs keep themselves to the background more. Otherwise though, yeah, I just have a pretty good time with this, so I'll be giving the Lazarus Experiment a 7.5 out of 10. Chris Chibnall's Doctor Who debut is actually better than I remembered. Like much of the season so far, it's nothing spectacular, but it's a perfectly solid base Under Siege. The guest cast are on the more forgettable side, and this episode's gimmick of taking place in more or less real time doesn't particularly come across, but the idea of a living sun seeking revenge on a crew using it for fuel is pretty neat, and I like the whole burn with me mantra. Feels very classic Who. There's some great tension with the Doctor becoming affected as well, even to the point where he thinks he might regenerate, and the escape pod scene where Martha is jettisoned with seemingly no chance of rescue is genuinely brilliant. So, yeah, I still don't think 42 is a hidden gem, but the next time I rewatch it will certainly be with less trepidation. Another 7 out of 10. So, up to this point, Series 3 has been shockingly consistent, but it's lacked any out-and-out hits. But as we approach the end, that all changes, as Human Nature and the Family of Blood, Paul Cornell's adaptation of his own Seventh Doctor novel, is an utterly gorgeous piece of storytelling that shows us both what's so special and so scary about the Doctor. The idea of turning the Doctor human, with the memory of his adventures living on only in dreams, is fantastic, and I love how the story keeps teasing you about the Doctor making a triumphant return, only for it to keep not happening. The anticipation and tension is brutal, and then the second part punches you right in the gut as John Smith is forced to accept that he's an invention. And yet, he's real. This moral dilemma is heartbreaking, and David Tennant's performance is outstanding as John grapples with having to sacrifice his life and newfound love for the sake of others. It's a hauntingly beautiful character study of humanity and the Doctor's own relationship with us. The only bit that doesn't hit quite as hard as it could have is the Doctor not even considering that he would fall in love so soon after we've witnessed his relationship with Rose. But everything else? Mwah. What's more, the Family of Blood make for a superb adversary. Their ethereal nature and contempt for human life is a terrifying combination, and each of their human forms are given suitably unnerving performances, particularly Harry Lloyd as Son of Mine. His simple narration as the Doctor ensures the family will indeed live forever is nothing short of chilling. All told, Human Nature and the Family of Blood is exactly the kind of story that this season has been lacking, full of heart and pathos and shining a brand new light on an age-old character. I'll be giving it a 9.5 out of 10. The new series has often struggled to create monsters with the same staying power as the classic series' most iconic foes. The Weeping Angels are the one big exception to that rule, and with Blink, it's easy to see why. Stephen Moffat is a master of taking the ordinary and mundane and putting a simple, terrifying twist on it. In this case, statues. The gimmick of them only being able to move when they're not observed is brilliant by itself, but the further wrinkle that they don't actually kill you, but send you back in time to live out your days away from anything you ever knew or loved, ensures your heart also thumps in sorrow as well as fear. So, a fantastic monster, very well utilized. Additionally, Blink is probably the best example of the show's Doctor Light format, focusing instead on one-off guest character Sally Sparrow, who's a fun protagonist to follow and whose introduction to the Doctor's world is refreshingly unconventional. I love that, for the most part, the Doctor and Martha appear only through decades-old recordings that have been carefully engineered to reach Sally specifically, with their conversation across the decades and ingenious use of time travel, and how the Doctor, despite being trapped, is still able to use time to his advantage. Now, given this story's reputation, I do have to admit I think it's ever so slightly overrated. I agree it's one of Doctor Who's best stories, but I don't think it's among the best of the best. But all things considered, that doesn't really mean much. Its legacy has endured nearly 20 years now for a reason, and I'll gladly be giving it a 9 out of 10. Buckle up, boys and girls, because I've got a lot to say about this one. As I mentioned earlier, this trilogy of episodes holds a very special place in my heart because it was my proper introduction to Doctor Who. Not intentionally, I'd just seen bits and pieces here and there, and as I gradually became more interested, this trilogy just happened to be the story I actually sat down and watched. And I absolutely loved it. The glimpses of previous adventures, the reignited rivalry with an old foe, the world-ending stakes, and the presence of paradoxes. It opened my eyes to everything Doctor Who could be, and I couldn't wait to see more. So rewatching this story is always nostalgic for me, and I don't mind admitting that I'm probably far more forgiving of its flaws than most. That being said, I still think there's lots that's genuinely worth praising. Let's start with Utopia, which is an incredibly atmospheric start. The simple but frightening prospect of the end of the universe, humanity clinging on to survival with the hope of reaching Utopia. This works really well, especially through the lens of Professor Yana, the kindly old man whose brilliance rivals even the Doctor's, and who's made it his mission to ensure everyone else reaches Utopia. Derek Jacobi is brilliant in this role, but even better is the revelation that Yana is in fact a chameleon-arched Time Lord, and not just any Time Lord, but the Master. This is perhaps the greatest twist reveal in the show's history. The simplicity of the writing, the urgency of the editing, the power of the acting, the majesty of the music. Everything works in perfect synchronicity to create a moment that never fails to leave me breathless, no matter how many times I rewatch it. Jacobi is just as magnificent with the quiet menace and seething malice of the Master as he was with Yana, so it's a real shame his incarnation is so short-lived on screen. David Tennant gives an equally enthralling performance. His sheer terror at who the Time Lord might be is immensely unsettling. We so rarely see the Doctor lose their cool like this. My only real issue with this episode are the future kind, who are a pretty generic and forgettable threat, but everything else more than makes up for it. But of course, this is only the beginning. The Master regenerates and ends up ingratiating himself as the UK's Prime Minister on modern-day Earth. I love that this is a story where the Master actually wins. He gets what he's always wanted, seizing control and becoming Master of the Earth. Obviously, this doesn't stick, and the majority of his reign is undone, and while this approach can often be annoying and make the whole thing feel like a waste of time, I think the way it's done here more or less avoids this issue by having everyone in the eye of the storm retain their experiences. The year was undone, but not erased, which means there are still real stakes, real consequences that have a lasting impact. The Jones family is haunted by everything they've witnessed, in part leading Martha to stay behind and help them recover, but also the Master, who, in a fantastic conclusion to his reign of terror, is shot and refuses to regenerate again, purely despite the Doctor, the only person willing to forgive him after all the atrocities he's committed. I do think RTD's take on the Master is pretty hit and miss, but this, he gets absolutely spot on. The Master is a monster, yet the Doctor mourns him anyways. And the hope of finding another of his people, only for it to be stolen away from him, to become alone again, is in my opinion the peak of the Doctor's journey as the last of the Time Lords. I also much prefer the Toclafane to the future kind. There's something so menacingly simple about these hovering spheres, and the revelation that they are the ultimate fate for humanity is haunting. Elsewhere, the story uses Jack and Martha to great effect. With Jack, we really dig into the consequences of his last meeting with the Doctor, and Martha gets the opportunity to take charge and save the day herself by traveling the Earth and encouraging people to rise up against the Master in the only way he can't prevent, by thinking. Yes, it is a bit over the top that this basically gives the Doctor superpowers, but I actually think using the Master's own system of mind control against him is really clever, and I'm willing to forgive the execution. So yeah, this story isn't perfect, but I don't really care. I never fail to have a blast watching it, and I'll forever be thankful to it for sparking my love for this wonderful show. 9 out of 10. To this day, Series 3 remains one of my favorite seasons of Doctor Who. I think Martha is a brilliant companion, probably my favorite of RTD's, who's only held back by the unrequited love storyline. Tennant's Doctor continues to be great too, and when he isn't pining after Rose, his dynamic with Martha is much more interesting. I also enjoy what we see of the Jones family, though it never reaches the emotional depth of the Tylers, and while I like the Saxon arc in theory, I do feel there's a missed opportunity to have actually seen Saxon in person before the finale, so that we get the same I know that voice moment that Martha got in Utopia. But these are minor complaints. Above all, what strikes me on this rewatch is how remarkably consistent this season is. While the first half isn't amazing, it's incredibly solid, with this stretch forming, I believe, the longest streak of stories that never drops below a 7 out of 10 for me. And then, of course, the latter part of the season is utterly brilliant, with the 6-episode run from Human Nature through Last of the Time Lords being one of my all-time favorites. So I wouldn't go so far as to say this is the best season, but it's definitely up there, and I'm amazed at just how confident it feels all the way through. Great stuff. But before I go, it's time to add Series 3 to my new series statistics. Firstly, how would I rank the stories within this season? Human Nature and the Family of Blood is at the top with a 9.5 out of 10, followed by Utopia, The Sound of Drums and Last of the Time Lords, and Blink with 9 out of 10. Smith & Jones, Daleks in Manhattan and Evolution of the Daleks, and The Lazarus Experiment with 7.5 out of 10. And finally, Gridlock, 42, The Shakespeare Code, and The Runaway Bride, all with 7 out of 10. Altogether, they give Series 3 an average score of 7.89 out of 10. After a dip with Series 2, this season brings the scores for both the 2000s and RTD's time as showrunner back up a bit to 7.58 out of 10, while David Tennant's average score increases to 7.31. For this season's writers, Paul Cornell is in second with a new score of 9.25 out of 10, Stephen Moffat is in fourth with an increased score of 8.83 out of 10, Helen Rayner and Stephen Greenhorn enter in 7th and 8th, both with 7.5 out of 10, Russell T. Davis is in 9th with a new average of 7.3 out of 10, and finally, Chris Chibnall and Gareth Roberts enter in 10th and 11th, both with a score of 7 out of 10. For directors, Colin Teague and Hetty MacDonald take the top 2 spots, both with 9 out of 10, followed by James Strong in 4th with 8.25 out of 10, Graham Harper and Charles Palmer in 5th and 6th, both with an average of 8 out of 10, Richard Clark enters in 8th with 7.25 out of 10, and finally, Euros Lynn is in 10th with a new score of 6.64 out of 10. In terms of premieres, Smith & Jones slots neatly in the middle, bringing the premiere average up to 6.5, while Utopia, The Sound of Drums, and Last of the Time Lords is similarly sandwiched with a new finale score of 8.67. The Runaway Bride also enters the specials list below the Christmas Invasion, creating an average of 7.25 out of 10. Meanwhile, the top 10 has 3 new additions, with Human Nature and the Family of Blood in 2nd, Utopia, The Sound of Drums, and Last of the Time Lords in 6th, and Blink in 7th. While the bottom 10 includes Gridlock 10th from the bottom, 42 at 9th, The Shakespeare Code 8th, and finally The Runaway Bride 6th from the bottom. Finally, in the full ranking, Human Nature and the Family of Blood is 2nd, Utopia, The Sound of Drums, and Last of the Time Lords is 6th, Blink is 7th, Smith & Jones 15th, Daleks in Manhattan and Evolution of the Daleks 16th, The Lazarus Experiment, Gridlock 42, and The Shakespeare Code filling out 21st to 24th, and The Runaway Bride in 26th, out of a total of 31 stories. And that's what I think of Series 3. After a rocky previous season, I found this to be a wholly enjoyable experience. This is a season of Doctor Who I'll always be excited to revisit, no matter how many times I see it. But what do you think? Are you as filled with nostalgia for it as I am? Or do you think I've been blinded to its flaws? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you guys later.